Dave. Welcome to Fraud Busting. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Glad to be here.
Well, I was so thrilled because we got to speak at the same conference. We were at the Bankers
Security
Bankers Hotline. That's what it was, Bankers
Yes.
Hotline Security. And I was so thrilled that that you were there, kind of backing me up on what I was saying, and I could just tell the depth of your knowledge. And so that's how we ended up here today. So why don't you tell us all about you? What do you do now? How'd you get to where you are? Let's start there.
Well, I started off as a special agent with the railroad, doing interstate theft investigations, and then went to suburban Chicago Police Department, where I spent about 3 years doing patrol and investigations. And then I left there to be a polygraph examiner, and spent about 3 years doing that. And that's where I met my partner, Doug Wicklander. And in 1982, we opened a company that very inventively we named Wicklander, Zulawski and Associates. So, that was back in 82. So I think we're going on our 38th year. So.
Oh my goodness. And so what are y'all specializing in today?
Well, we do two parts of the business. One is investigation, and we do that for private companies. We assist police departments on preparing for interviews or helping them do them. The other part of the business is training how we do that. And so we train most of the major businesses in the country. If you walk through a mall or drive down the street, they send their investigators to us to teach them about the patterns that we use to do an actual interview with somebody. And then we train local, state, federal governments, inspector generals. We probably do, 450 seminars around the globe each year. So it's two parts. One is what we do, and the other is kind of how we do it. And training.
Oh, well, those sound like a lot of the same classes that I've been through, real similar. You probably know Stan Walters. I trained
Sure.
with him. Yeah. So, okay, so you have a lot here going on, and I want to know about it. I know my audience wants to know about it. So, first thing, let's talk about the railroad, because I didn't realize till too long ago that railroads have their own police force, pretty much. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Or yeah, and so
Go
talk
ahead,
about that.
Well, basically, it's like an internal security function. Historically, the railroads had to provide their own protection back before there was police departments, especially as they proceeded west. And at one point, they hired out to like Pinkerton's or a Wells Fargo to handle that, and later brought it in-house. In Illinois, where I'm based, the special agent has powers for investigating any crimes against the railroad, both on and off railroad property. And then also the dual responsibility of handling internal investigations from employees that would do anything from be drinking or drugs on the job to internal theft or frauds. So it's quite a wide-based investigative effort.
Wow. Now, let's back up a little bit, because I think you have I bet you're going to have some knowledge on this with because I was watching this thing on the History Channel not too long ago about the Pinkertons. And they, because there was a problem at a steel mill, I think, where they got into trouble, and this is just little history background fun stuff, right? And didn't they shoot a bunch of people on strike, or how did that go? How big was the company at that time? Like
I know the general details of the incident. Most of the time, especially in the early years when the railroads were outsourcing things. Um, there was less investigation. It was a little more strong arm union busting kind of stuff that they would do for the railroads. And so there was, frankly, I bet, a lot of brutality involved. And it wasn't just Pinkerton's, Wells Fargo. There's a number of early entities that worked for large corporations that were a bit heavy-handed.
Well, I imagine so. Things weren't quite always as PC in days gone by, I think, as now. So anyways, that's just kind of interesting. It came up here in Denver because we had a TV reporter who they hired a bodyguard for, and they said who ended up shooting someone at one of these protests here in the last couple of months. And they said they hired him from Pinkerton. So are they still around, or is that a knockoff? Do you know?
No, it's the original organization.
Oh, really?
I don't know what happened there, but Pinkerton's has been around for years. They're still very much in business and provide guards, provide investigative services. So they're kind of a full service operation. They also do international. We've trained some of their investigators out of Asia, where they have folks out there that are basically doing the same things, that they would do international investigations overseas.
Oh, interesting. That is fascinating, because I figured it was some new knockoff variety of Pinkertons with a sketchy history that they ended up hiring.
No, if they're using the name Pinkertons, I would imagine that it's the original group.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool. So here's what else I want to talk to you about is Polygraph. Let's talk about that. And I'll tell you a funny story. So when I showed up to Stan's class, and I'm sure they're a lot like your classes, you got 30 guys and a couple girls in the back of a police station squad room somewhere. And so I get there, and they hand out the class list. That's the first thing he did. Like, who's there? What do they do? And there were 5 guys that listed their occupation as polygrapher, which I did not know what it was. I was thinking something different. And so I nudged the girl I was sitting next to, and I said, so all these guys have 5 wives? I was like, that's the main thing that they put down. And she's like, no, that's polygamist. These are the polygraph guys. I was like, oh, right. Got it. So let's talk about polygraph, because I'm sure you've had some pretty unique experiences with those. And what are they really measuring? And if I'm right, they're not admissible in court. So and I'm sure there's some gray area there, but why don't you tell me a little bit about, and tell us a little bit about the background there, how it works, the whole thing, because we could probably talk about this for hours.
Well, first of all, you're right. It's generally not admissible in court. There are certain exceptions if lawyers on both sides agree and the judge agrees, then the examiner can testify. Typically where it's used rather than in a courtroom setting is much more of an investigative effort. So you're looking to eliminate truthful people from an investigation and ultimately, hopefully, focus on the person who's responsible. While it's called a lie detector, it doesn't detect lies. What it does is it detects changes in the body's physiology. So typically what you're measuring is respiration patterns. You're measuring GSR, galvanic skin response, changes in the blood pressure. And when there's a fear of detection, generally the theory goes that if you're afraid, your body undergoes some physiological changes, which could be changes in the level of breathing. It could be a rise in blood pressure, change in flow of blood to the tips of the fingers. So there's a lot of things that are measured, and there's other things that can be measured, but that's kind of what a basic polygraph revolves around. And a test itself is generally very upfront. You do a pre-test interview where you talk through the issue that you're investigating. Then you go over all the questions that you're going to use on the test so that there's no surprise questions. And then you run a series of 3 to 4 tests that last generally 2 to 2.5 minutes in length. And then at the conclusion, then there's a numeric value that you score it and reach a decision of deception indicated or no deception indicated.
Now, here's a question. So some friends of mine are in defense, have to get security clearance and things like that. And oftentimes they'll bring in a polygraph, and they say that the guys running the thing like do their best to get them mad and to make people angry during the test. Is that common? Have you heard of that? It seemed unusual to me.
I mean, you're asking some fairly uncomfortable questions. So there's 3 types of questions that are asked. So the first question would be what we would call an irrelevant. Do some people call you Traci? Are you over 18 years of age? Are you at home right now? So these are known truths, and they're not measured for anything related to deception. They're simply a neutral way to start the test, to do spacing during the test.
Baseline,
Right, to bring a person, if they cough or something, you may use a couple of those to bring the body back to a normal. And then there's the relevant question, which would address the issue. So did you steal the $1,000 out of the safe? Do you know who stole the $1,000 out of the safe? They're very direct yes or no questions. So if the person said, well, I suspect Sally. Okay. Do you know for sure who did it? Well, no, you don't, because you only suspect. So we're going to modify the question because we want you to pass. And then there's a comparison question on most tests, which would be what we would call a control question. And a control question would be, if we were dealing with a theft issue, would be, did you ever steal anything in your life? And the person might say, well, when I was a kid, I took a pair of socks. Okay. Besides the pair of socks, or before before age 18, did you steal anything else? Or after age 18, did you steal anything else in your life? And there's probably, if you think about this as, if you didn't steal the $1,000 out of the safe, what's more concerning? Is there anything else in your life that you stole? So it's basically a comparison. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's kind of the general idea. So a larger response to the relevant question, did you steal the $1,000? Deception would be indicated. On the other side, if it was more responsive to the control question, no deception would be indicated.
Wow.
But to go back to the point that you made earlier, an examiner wants to be neutral. So you don't want to get somebody mad. Asking a question, about did you steal anything in your life, it's a little personal, kind of a bit of a poke, and some people, kind of get their back up a little bit, but it's not done to make anybody angry. That's the last thing you want, because that'll change the recordings, the baseline of the person, and just makes the evaluation much more difficult.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I found it very odd when they were talking about that, and it wasn't just one of them. And anyway, so who knows how our security clearances are going these days with their accuracy. Now, what's the craziest polygraph situation you've been in? Do you have any that have been really unique?
Probably the more, I wouldn't say unique, but homicides. Polygraphed a a fellow who was suspected of murdering she was a drug dealer, a prostitute, and she ended up being murdered, put in a truck, and then the truck set afire.
Oh.
And he was picked up asleep in a barber shop that was adjacent to where the fire was set. And so I polygraphed him, and he was deceptive. And then, he had said that he was staying overnight there and just sleeping there. And, after several polygraphs and several interrogations, we moved him from, well, okay, I wasn't asleep. Well, okay, I heard something. Well, okay, I watched the whole thing out the back window. Mm-hmm. Now, coincidentally, the barbershop was owned by a sergeant on a police department, and his daughter had been killed, murdered in a bathtub. Oh. And so he actually did both of the murders. And what was kind of odd, we had him into the office to do the last polygraph, and after we were done, he wanted a hug. So he's currently unavailable for dinner anywhere except in the prison.
Now, wait a minute, he wanted a hug. Now let's talk about that a little bit, because what you want to do is make people so comfortable with you that they'll tell you the truth. And I've never heard of someone wanting a hug before. So how did you get from picking him up to wanting a hug? How does that unfold?
Well, it's first of all, it's a non-confrontational style. Mm-hmm. If you're just going in and, accusing people, the first thing they're going to say is no. Mm-hmm. And the important part is to keep people talking. And you do that by showing empathy, showing understanding for their lifestyle, the difficulties that they have, and slowly moving through inconsistencies to get closer and closer to the truth. Mm-hmm. Now with him, the truth only came after the DNA came back from both murders.
Oh.
So that made it a lot simpler, but there was, from a deception standpoint, there was, no question that he was involved. So.
Right. Now, did it take the polygraph to figure that out, or could you see it body language wise?
During the pre-test interview, where you go through the case facts, the person's story, other things, you have an idea that the person's probably not going to do too well on the test. Uh-huh. At the end of the day, the evaluation of the charts makes the decision, but you do have an indication based on the person's answers, sometimes their body language, that will help you make a judgment about what their status in the investigation is.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other investigations now. Because you said you were working in Chicago, but now you're working for private companies, and is it more interesting, like when you're let's call it in the public sector or in the private area with companies? What strikes you as the most unusual?
They're very different. If you're doing something with an inspector general's investigators, they're very much like the private sector, but the government is their sector. So they're doing investigation of purchasing or collusion or bribe taking. So to me, an inspector general type of a situation is very similar to what an internal investigator would be for a company. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about a police function, You know, it's a very different world because, you know, there's people that have guns. There's, you know, there's having to enter buildings by force, take people into custody. So it's a very different kind of an environment. So, you know, the older I get, the less I need to have sirens and screaming and yelling. You know, it's the private sector is a much more civilized place to work than necessarily the streets are.
Got it. Okay, so what's the crazy? Because I asked all my guesses. What's the craziest fraud story or scam that you've investigated? Or let's leave it there.
I mean, there's a lot of real goofy ones. I mean, we had very often in offices, women would wear their gym shoes to get from the train and then have a pair of dress shoes at the office. And the dress shoes were being stolen. And they were finding them different places. And so we narrowed it down, and it turned out that there was a security officer who was responsible for guarding the facility after hours, and he was stealing the shoes and wearing them during his shift.
Oh no!
Yeah, so you know, anytime you start to get into fetishes or sexual types of crimes, they're a little boggling of the eye.
Uh-huh.
You know, I mean, it's like, I can't think of the fellow's name right off the top of my head, but just got fired for having his pants off during a Zoom call. One of the news people, I think.
Uh-huh.
You know, but that type of basic, fundamental, primitive emotion really can take a person off the rails. And it's a little hard for other people to understand why something like that might happen.
Mm-hmm. What's your thought on why that happens? Having probably seen it more than a few times.
You mean
like wearing women's shoes or not wearing pants on purpose, or it's kind of a joke right now, you know, not wearing pants on Zoom, but I think that was fine for like March and April, but we're coming on Thanksgiving here. I think if people would smarten up, or what's your thought on that?
I think it's it's such a basic driving emotion for people to have to procreate so that the race can continue. I mean, if you look at any animal, the need to reproduce is fundamental, and it causes people to do all sorts of things. I mean, many frauds are directly related to sexual activity.
Mm-hmm.
A person has a mistress. He's only got X amount of money coming in, but he wants to take her out to dinner. He wants to go to a hotel. So where does he get that? Well, let's do an expense fraud,
mm-hmm.
or let's take kickbacks or whatever. So, you know, at the motive at the very fundamental is economic, but there's a driving force behind that, which is sexual desire.
Oh, wow. Okay. I never thought about that. So then let's talk about investigations, and how is someone comes to you and says, maybe it's not so overt as like shoes are missing, right? But maybe it's been a while and they're noticing some irregularities in the balance sheet or in expense accounts. What's your first step? Like if anyone's listening that's having that, what would you advise them to do? How would it differ from what you would do as an investigator coming in?
Probably the first and most important thing is don't share it with the world. Okay. Most of the frauds that come in place are not discovered by an audit once in a while you'll stumble across something, but you got to know, part of a fraud is knowing exactly where to look. And then it's pretty easy. I mean, the thread starts to come out and you can tease it away. But, if you've got a vendor fraud, I mean, you take a major Fortune 500 company or a big department store, they might have 70,000 vendors. Well, who do you look at?
Right.
So a lot of times where you're going to get your first thing, it's going to be a tip. Somebody's going to call a hotline. Somebody's going to go to a senior executive and say, I don't know what this means, but here's what I saw. Mm-hmm. Or somebody's going to stumble across something. Person takes a vacation and all of a sudden an envelope comes in and it's got an invoice. They look at it, they start to check, and all of a sudden things don't look right. Mm-hmm. So it's more likely to be either a tip or a stumble across it. Although now with some of the computer analytics, you're able to fairly quickly look at somebody. So if you've got a cashier who's running 100, well, that's a crazy number, 500% more refunds than anybody else in the company, you ought to go look. I mean, it might be that, they're working in a place where they would get that or they're assigned to it. But if they're just an average line cashier and all of a sudden you're seeing these refunds and they're way out of line with everybody else, what's going on here? Something's got to be wrong. And so first thing is that you begin to compile a background of the person. How long have they been around? What's their life like? Do we have video camera? If we don't have video, can we put a camera up? What can we do in the way of examining documents that might be available? So do we have refunds? Do we have signatures that we can look to compare? So the most important thing is loose lips sink ships. Mm-hmm. So if all of a sudden, we just had one earlier this week that we did. It's probably worth about $500,000.
Oh, wow.
They stumble across. It was a dealership, and they had an individual who was going out and actually buying used vehicles. And he had the ability, and there was, again, no control, which is why a fraud happens. He had the ability to write the check, make the purchase. He handles the whole transaction. Well, all of a sudden, here you're getting checks for cash for over $10,000. Mm-hmm. And is it a legitimate purchase? Well, you'd start looking at the titles. It doesn't look right. You start to look at the bill of sale. Signatures don't look right. Talk to the customer. Well, that's not what I sold this vehicle for.
Oh.
So now you're seeing, okay, we got the vehicle, so that's not the problem. The problem is over here that he bought it for $8,000, wrote the check for $10,000 to cash, kept $2,000.
Oh.
So it's a real simple scheme when you have those kinds of things. It becomes a little more complex if all of a sudden you have somebody involved in we had a case with ice machines. He was in charge of constructing like convenience stores for his company. So he had the ability to purchase up to $1,000 on his signature, and he could authorize that. Well, what was happening is he worked with a carpenter who was supposed to build the store, but he bought non-existent ice machines for $956.
Oh.
So the carpenter would send him a bill for $956. He would sign off, it's approved, and they would split the $956. So a real simple little scheme, but about $100,000 over a 6-month period. Uh-huh. And it all comes to light when somebody one of the senior executives called and said to the guy, the convenience store owner, how do you like that new ice machine? The guy, what ice machine? And so then they started looking, and all of a sudden it unravels.
Oh, wow.
So then it becomes an issue of, well, how do you close the case? We've got two people involved. We've got the carpenter, and we've got the director of construction.
Mm-hmm.
So now, we've got the pieces. How do you close the case?
Yeah, how'd you do it?
Well, what we did is we staggered the interviews. So we brought the director of construction in first,
Mm-hmm.
and brought him in with one of the senior executives to talk about general operational issues. Now, about a half hour after I start that interview, one of my partners meets with the construction guy. So we've got a lag time of about 30 minutes. So as I begin to find things, I can then take and pass that off to him if there's any information that'll be helpful to him.
Oh, wow.
But we go through the business and start talking about, well, what does this guy do? What does this guy provide for you? What does this guy provide for you? And somewhere in there mixed in is, what does the carpenter do for you? Oh, well, he puts up shelf, he does this, he does this. Does he do anything else for you? No, he doesn't. Okay, well, now we've got $100,000 worth of ice machines that supposedly came from him. He's got to be lying.
Mm-hmm.
Now if he had said, well, sometimes he provides ice machines, well, now that evidence is not a suspect because he's, it actually has the information. He's giving us that without knowing what we know at this point. And so the easiest way to detect deception is when you got a piece of evidence and the person lies about it. So they're still lying to you until they tell you what it is that you know.
Right. So then, so that goes into prep, right, before the interview, right? So because it's pretty common to go in and not expect any new information because you already know it. But if you get new information, that's a bonus in a certain sense. Or what's your take on that?
Well, my sense of large-scale frauds is whatever you know is not everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's not unusual to hear about. To me, this is the guy wants money, which is why he's involved in doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So he opens the spigot and starts to divert money. So here, money for purchasing of ice machines.
Mm-hmm.
But there's hundreds of vendors that he deals with. So how many other spigots has he opened?
Oh, right.
And so that's what you're looking for here is what other problems that you don't know about. We had a case not too long ago that a senior executive vice president, he was a senior member of the team,
Mm-hmm.
had purchased $6,000 worth of gift cards on his American Express.
That's always a red flag. Those gift cards. Oh my gosh. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Well, they talked to us and we said, well, let's check. Well, he claimed he used it for gifts at a golf outing. Well, we can't find the golf outing.
Oh.
We can't do so. His story to the president of the company can't be true because where he says it happened and when he says it happened, it didn't happen. So the president decided that this guy was too valuable and just said, you know what, don't do that anymore. And I said, well, you better watch him. Well, 6 months later, he's working with a vendor to the tune of $60,000 a month. So, these folks, when they need the money, they want the money, they're going to get the money if they've got the controls, and and there is no controls holding them in place, or nobody's monitoring those controls.
Now, what was he doing with the vendor at $60K a month? How was
it? Was essentially a kickback.
Oh,
So he was saying, this vendor was providing $100,000 worth of IT
okay.
consulting. Well, he wasn't providing anywhere near that. It was closer to $35,000 to $40,000 a month, and he was upping it by 60. He had control, so he could sign off on that invoice. That invoice then gets paid, and the money comes back to him.
How did that one get revealed?
Well, initially, what he wanted to do and how he was able to conceal it was he wanted control of his own financial of his division.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was that all of a sudden the corporate auditors went in and started to look at this big jump in IT consulting, and why do we need that, whatever. And that's when we started to look at it. But anytime you get collusion and you've got somebody who, people will divert anything. Pallets, used cardboard. It just kind of boggles the mind as to what they'll do.
Pallets and cardboard. What do you know about that? That seems like the least valuable thing that people could think about.
You would think so. However, if you're recycling cardboard or you're recycling pallets, there's a value to those.
Okay.
And so stealing the cardboard was costing the company $10,000 a month in recycling fees.
Really?
Yeah. We see this all the time in metal.
Yeah, metal. I believe that.
Metal. It's it hasn't got a skew on it. It's really an uncontrolled piece, and they begin to divert the money to them, and goes away from the company, and so there's a substantial loss.
Wow. How do you find that? Is it the same audit thing where all of a sudden the line item goes away, or?
Well, in the last one that we did, it was actually a tip from a secretary. She was responsible for sending the check from the recycling to the corporate office.
Okay.
And all of a sudden she noticed that there had been no checks coming, but she'd seen the recycler coming.
Oh.
And so that started the investigation, and it turned out that we ended up taking the head of the union, the head of the location. They were terminated. That led to 3 other cases of other people doing exactly the same thing, because the controls. And finally, the owner of the company said, "Well, we're going to stop because I can't afford to lose any more people. We'll just tighten up the controls and put a stop to this."
Oh, wow. So he just didn't want to dig any deeper.
Well, no, because at some point he couldn't operate his business if we kept taking out, his senior people at each location.
Oh my gosh.
So he had to make an economic decision. Am I going to continue to terminate people, or should I kind of cut my losses, put in controls so that we're now monitoring this and basically shutting that spigot off.
Oh my God! What kind of company was it, or is it?
They were a large construction repair company. So they would take and buy like huge anything from a bobcat to an excavator, and they would take them for parts, and what they didn't need anymore would go into the scrap.
Oh wow! So they had a lot of metal, sounds like.
Yeah, and it's just like everything else. When you started to do the backgrounds, all of a sudden the person's got a home in St. Thomas,
Oh.
And his wife's unemployed, but she's driving a brand new Mercedes, and he's driving a new Mercedes. And, they've got, they just came back from a 2-week vacation, at a very high-class resort. So clearly they've got way more money than they should have based on his salary alone.
Wow, interesting. Oh my gosh. You are just a wealth of knowledge here. So I don't want to I could keep you all day, but I don't want to keep you all day. So you got any final tips for people listening who, either may have their eyes closed to what's going on around them, like how to open their eyes up easily, or how to protect yourself just a little bit more these days? Because, with the economy, how it is, the opportunity for fraud, the people with their backs against the wall are increased 10, maybe 100-fold. So what's your parting tip for people?
Well, the hard part is trust, because the people you work with, you want to trust, and you may like them a lot. A lot of the people that do this kind of stuff, it can be pretty glib. They can be, nice talkers. So you want to believe them. So when we get there and we start looking, we go, oh my God, this is clear as a bell. But you're looking at it through rose-colored glasses, as they would say. And we're looking at it in a much different way. We don't have all the relationships and the trust that's been built up over the years. So, pretty fundamental in any fraud is checks and balances. You can't have accounts receivable and accounts payable with one person without any controls over it. A lot of these people, their story will be, I do what's necessary to get the job done. So I need to cut these checks early. Well, if something unusual is happening, take a deep dive on it. That's probably the most important thing. And if you've got somebody who is got financial problems, you need to watch them because they have a need for money. If you've got somebody who kind of plays loose and runs with other people other than their spouse, you better pay attention to business. And some of them will be the most trusted people in the world. We had a case of expense fraud, and the guy flew international, and audit stumbled across the fact that he's in China, and he's putting in for a $500 dinner in Chicago.
Oh, oh boy.
Well, we start looking, and this guy is he buys a first-class ticket to China. Might cost $12,000.
Yeah.
But then what he does is he puts in that receipt as an expense, but then he takes his airline points and gets a free first-class ticket. And now he's got $12,000 of the company's money in his pocket. So,
oh, wow. Okay.
So that little dinner was just the beginning of a thread. And when you started to tease it out and you started to look, and now all of a sudden, the guy's got a vineyard in Michigan. He's got this, he's got that. And so a lot of things begin small and you don't quite know where they're going to go. So I guess watch the controls, make sure you got controls in place. And when something doesn't look right, take a deep dive and don't tell everybody.
Right. Keep your mouth shut. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's, a lot of times there's evidence to be had as long as that person doesn't know you're looking at. And it's also easier to look at them and talk to them if they have no idea you're coming.
Okay. Okay. So a little surprise ambush can help.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Okay. So, Dave, how can people get a hold of you if they need help, or maybe talk about classes? What's your website? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Probably the easiest is through the website. It's w-z as in zebra.com. So just w-z.com. And I can be reached at dzulawski@wz.com. So that's probably the easiest way, and we can arrange a call or whatever.
Yeah. Well, the depth of your knowledge is really impressive. I thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, glad it was. I enjoyed it.
Good deal.